Good morning all, and you're very welcome to day 2 of this virtual All-Ireland Innovation Programme Conference 2020, supported by InterTradeIreland. At Queen's University Belfast, we have been a partner on the All-Ireland Innovation Programme since it began, and we are proud to be involved. The second of our conference keynote speakers on our theme of enhancing the SME innovation ecosystem for competitive advantage is Professor Stephen Roper. Stephen is a Professor of Enterprise at Warwick University and Director of the Enterprise Research Centre. He has over 30 years' experience of researching issues related to small and medium-sized enterprises, innovation and innovation policy in the UK and internationally, and has published widely in both areas. He has led over 70 externally funded projects and has been a member of a number of government advisory boards. His talk today is entitled, After the Storm, Reshaping the SME innovation ecosystem beyond the worst of COVID-19, and will explore how past and present experiences have and may still affect the future of innovation in the UK and Ireland. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to hand you over to Professor Stephen Roper. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this session which will discuss how, after the worst of the COVID-19 storm, we can reshape the innovation ecosystem to support SMEs and their innovative activity. Before we come to the main theme of today, let me just introduce myself briefly. My name is Stephen Roper. I'm Professor of Enterprise at Warwick Business School, and I've been here since around 2009. Before my time here at Warwick, I worked for some years in Belfast, and I'm delighted that I'm still an honorary professor at Queen's University Management School. Here in Warwick, my day job is as director of something called the Enterprise Research Centre, which is a primary research centre focused on small business research, funded by the government and academic funders to provide government here and internationally with advice around small business and innovation policy. And personally, I've worked with a number of governments around the world and with the OECD and the World Bank on international projects looking at innovation support for small companies. So my main research interests, unsurprisingly, around innovation and the development of policy. And when I'm not working, you'll find me either running around the streets of the Midlands or playing in the pottery studio, which I have at the bottom of my garden. So let's turn to the theme for today. The storm brought by COVID-19 continues to have very significant effects on businesses. And at the time I'm recording this, areas of England are moving into what we're calling Tier 3 lockdown. So many businesses closed. And I understand the same is true in many parts of Ireland as well at the current time, and Northern Ireland. So serious effects on many individual sectors. I want to look a little bit this afternoon at how this is impacting SMEs, small firms' innovation activity, what this suggests about the future of innovation, and how government agencies should support innovation in firms, and particularly smaller firms, going forward. So I've kind of got 4 things on my agenda for this afternoon. I want to look back first to the great financial crisis of 2008 to 2010 and see what we can learn about the way in which innovation reacted to that crisis, or firms reacted to that crisis. I want to talk briefly about how the experience of the UK compared to that of some other major OECD economies after that, because some have done much better and some worse over the last few years than the UK. And we might want to think about a little bit about why that is. I'll talk a little bit about what firms in England and across the UK are doing now about innovation. And we have some new survey data on that, which I'll talk about. And then I'll finish with some remarks about how we can reshape the ecosystem beyond the COVID storm, and what firms and government agencies can be doing to respond to the pressures of the moment. So first, let's start by looking at what past experience tells us about what might happen over the next few years. What did happen to innovation after the great financial crisis of 2008-2010? Well, the financial crisis of 2008 to 10 hit firms hard. And the key issue that many firms faced during that period was finding it difficult to get bank lending, overdrafts in particular. This had a very profound effect on the liquidity of firms and their ability to invest and continue trading. COVID is having some very similar effects, draining firms' financial resources due to lockdown, due to a difficulty in accessing markets and in many cases staying open, and reducing firms' ability to willingness to invest in innovation, particularly because of the risks involved. So the Great Financial Crisis and the COVID storm have some similarities, but we need to be a little careful about the direct parallels. But I think there's something we can learn from the experience of the Great Financial Crisis, and that's the focus of the next chart. So we have some data from something called the UK Innovation Survey. This is the main UK innovation survey done every couple of years. It's also done across Europe under the name of the Community Innovation Survey, and you have a very similar survey in Ireland that's done every 2 years at the same time. What this does is it measures the extent of innovative activity across the population of firms, and that's what these lines on this chart represent. You can see along the bottom the periods covered by the survey, 2006 to 8, 2008 to 10, which was the period of the Great Financial Crisis, and the years immediately after that. The blue line is the proportion of innovation active firms. That's a broad definition of firms engaged in different aspects of innovative activity. And what you see here is that this dropped by about a third in the period of the Great Financial Crisis, the years 2008 to 10. And it's never actually recovered, right up to 2016, it had never actually recovered its pre-recession level. And a similar sort of profile exists both for product and service innovation, which is the orange line here, and process innovation, which is the grey line. The key message here is that the impact of the Great Financial Crisis of 2008 to 10 had very lasting and rather long-term impacts on firms' willingness to innovate. It took 5, 6, 7 years for firms to recreate and rediscover the level of innovative activity they'd had in that earlier period. Now let's look at some other data. This is UK data on different sectors, and I appreciate the sectors are a little small on this chart and difficult to see. The green cells here are those years, and then we've got years across the top here. So are those years where firms had a level of R&D spend which was higher than the 2008 level. So this is a recovery from the recessionary level of R&D spend. The red is where sectors have a level of R&D spend which remains lower than that in the recessionary period. And what you see here is that some sectors never recovered, even through to 2016, their recessionary level of R&D spend. This was true of agriculture, it was true of a bunch of low-tech manufacturing industries, and it was true of a couple of service sectors, information and communication technologies and financial and insurance activities as well, all of which had levels of research and development spend, even as late as 2016, which were below their recessionary level. So you get a patchy picture with some sectors recovering from the recession and some not. And the question is, will this pattern of very diverse experience of recovery happen again post-COVID? So that was really what happened in the UK, but let's have a look quickly at how the UK compared to some other countries, because the patterns internationally have been very different in this kind of recovery of innovation from the Great Financial Crisis. So I've shown you this already. This is the picture in the UK. Green cells recovery, red cells doing worse than that in the recession. And if we turn to some other countries, you see vastly different patterns. Look at Spain on the left-hand side here. It's a sea of red. Almost all sectors in Spain continue to have levels of research and development spend below that of 2008. So most sectors in Spain, the levels of R&D spend have never recovered levels from 2008. So that sort of post-recession, post-Great Financial Crisis recovery in Spain just never happened in terms of R&D and innovation. South Korea is a completely different picture. All of these cells are green. That suggests that across the South Korean economy, the level of R&D, the level of innovative activity in almost all sectors has recovered sharply since the Great Financial Crisis. So we see this very strong differential pattern across countries. Now, partly that reflects sectoral influences, but it also reflects different countries' experience and commitment to boosting R&D spend over this period. So what we've seen over the post-Great Financial Crisis period is a big national effort in South Korea, particularly, to boost R&D and innovation and support growth in that sort of area. And a lot of government money has gone into this to support companies in that innovative activity. And you see from this chart, this is the increase in business R&D spending post 2008. And you see that South Korea tops the league table here with an increase in R&D spend of 73%. And that's dragged all of the sectors in South Korea along with it. The UK is in the middle of the league here, around a 23% increase in R&D spend since the recessionary period across the board nationally. And that's led to this rather patchy picture. And you see Spain, which we also looked at just a minute ago, where R&D spend in aggregate has fallen 13%. And so that puts most sectors into the red over that post-recessionary period. Another way of looking at this is to say how many sectors or what proportion of sectors in each country have recovered their level of pre-recession R&D spending. So here are Korea at the top of the league table again with 100%. So it's all green. All the sectors have recovered beyond their recessionary period. Spain at the bottom with very few sectors. The UK is kind of towards the top of the league table here. Around 2/3 of UK sectors have recovered their pre-recessionary level of R&D spending, but it still leaves 1/3 of UK industries with a level of research and development spending which is actually lower now, 2016, than it was at the time of the before the Great Financial Crisis. So again, this idea that recovery is very slow in terms of innovation and R&D. It could be 5, 6, 7 years beyond the end of the COVID storm before firms begin to completely recover to where they were before the COVID storm actually hit. So let's have a look at some short-term evidence now from 2020 about what firms are actually doing at this period. So in the summer this year, in July, we surveyed about 300 firms who are holders of Innovate UK grants. Innovate UK is the main UK government agency which supports R&D and innovation in firms. And we asked these firms what they were doing about innovation and how the COVID-19 crisis had impacted upon their R&D and innovation activity. And here's a couple of charts that illustrate some of the key findings from that survey. The first question we asked, well, how has R&D and innovation activity changed during COVID? Some firms increased their R&D activity, a small proportion, 5–10%. But you see here that around 40 to 50% of firms had reduced or reprioritized their R&D and innovation activity. And a further 10 or 15% had actually stopped either all or all critical R&D activity. So reflecting what we saw from the Great Financial Crisis, what we were seeing during the early months of the COVID storm was that firms were actually reacting by reducing quite sharply their investments in research and development and innovation. So it seems a bit like a repeat of the patterns that we saw in the earlier period. What was driving this? Well, here you see a number of different things. It varies a little bit by firms of different size in the different colours, but the availability of collaborators, access to buildings and facilities was difficult for firms, and that was one of the key reasons why firms were withdrawing from their R&D and innovation spend. Over this period in particular, at least in the UK, universities were closed. It was difficult for people to get into labs. Companies' lab facilities were often closed during the lockdown, and so it was very difficult for people to progress science development or technology development projects. So now this is us asking firms in June or July of 2020 what they were actually planning to do with R&D and innovation over the next 3 months. So that's looking into the autumn, third and fourth quarter of 2020. And what we see here again is that firms were looking to further reduce their R&D and innovation activity. So we'd seen already that firms during the immediate impact of the COVID storm from March to June 2020 had reduced their innovation activity already and their commitment to research and development and innovation. And many firms were looking to further reduce that as they moved into the next quarter. So what does all this suggest? So first, it suggests that when we hit storms like the COVID crisis, innovation falls sharply. And this broader story from the great financial crisis is reinforced by the short-term reactions of innovating firms in the UK at the moment. What does it mean? Well, firms are prioritising other uses of cash resources rather than investing in innovation and R&D, which might have longer-term benefits. The short-term constraints are critical here. And there have been practical issues around access to buildings and partners. This may ease if we can avoid national lockdowns, but seems likely to be with us for some time. Big picture, any recovery seems likely to be slow. Any recovery in innovation, perhaps 5 or more years before we get back to a pre-COVID sort of levels of activity. And if the experience of the past is to be believed, this will be very uneven by sector and region. So some sectors will fare much worse, recover much more slowly than some other regions. And in a UK context, at least, some regions, particularly the Northeast and the Northwest, may be worst hit. These are industrial regions where there's a predominance of manufacturing activity and traditional manufacturing activity, but agriculture also had a very slow recovery from the great financial crisis, and it may well be that agricultural R&D is another casualty of the COVID crisis. So, after the COVID storm, firms are likely to be more reluctant to invest in innovation and R&D. Risky, costly, and firms may have other priorities that are more short-term. So what does all this mean as we try and reconstruct the ecosystem after the COVID storm and support small companies with their future innovation? So let's move on and have a quick look at what that actually means. I suppose we need to start by thinking about what an ecosystem is. This is a rather complicated diagram that the OECD have developed, which tries to link together the different elements of an innovation ecosystem and the way in which lots of different factors come together to shape innovation performance. So in the middle of this chart, you have firms, you have universities, you have other research organizations working closely together to develop innovative projects. Around the edge, you have a number of the other factors which might shape the incentives for innovation or provide the context in which innovation takes place. So regulation, for example, may be an opportunity for innovation, or it may be a constraint. Product market conditions. If a market's growing fast, that may give a firm an incentive to innovate. Slow growing markets will probably provide less incentive to innovate. And the same is true around the edges. Education and training might provide the skills which firms need for innovation. I guess if we look at this chart, we might have a look at 4 ways in particular in which the COVID storm is impacting different elements of this ecosystem. I'll start in the top left here. We've already talked about the way in which the great financial crisis and the COVID crisis are impacting firms' willingness to invest in innovation and also the resources that they have available for innovative action. So that element of the ecosystem will be weaker post the COVID storm. COVID has also affected demand. Some demand in some sectors has increased, but demand in other sectors has generally been very flat. And so COVID has reprofiled demand, which may or may not be good for innovation. We know too that public agencies, governments have had to borrow a lot of money to support jobs, support firms during the COVID crisis. So government may be more reluctant to actually, or less able to actually support innovation going forward. And COVID has also had big impacts on universities, weakening their financial position and perhaps their ability to support innovation going forward. So COVID has had a complicated and messy sort of impact on this ecosystem. But what does it imply for how we might respond going forward? And I thought about 2 themes here. What does this mean for SMEs who want to innovate in the post-COVID era? Well, one thing that it might suggest is that collaboration for innovation is perhaps critical going forward. Because by collaborating, firms can reduce risks, share risks with partners, and share costs. So firms get innovation, but at less risk and less cost. And so this might be one of the key themes going forward. And we might support that as a sort of, by government, by different agencies, by perhaps providing higher grant levels for innovation, and by providing better information on potential innovation partners. So firms often find it difficult to find innovation partners. If we could provide, as a public service, a little bit more information about the potential capabilities of partners, that might actually enable those partnerships and build more collaborative innovation and help us to avoid some of the drop in innovative activity, or at least recover faster in terms of innovative activity than we saw previously. For universities, for catapults or other support agencies for innovation, I think this all means that ensuring continuity of support is critical. This might mean that for a university, for example, we need to think about rebalancing our research from more basic research, which has very long-term benefits potentially for society, towards more economically relevant applied in R&D and innovation, which may have sort of more short-term benefits and help us recover from the COVID crisis a little bit more quickly. It may also probably means that we need to keep our eye very closely on the commercialization pipeline, the way in which new ideas get from lab to market, because there will be a tendency, I think, for an underinvestment in that area. And so that needs to be something that we watch quite closely. And I think there will be a need to prioritize partnerships with small companies, by universities, by public labs, by different government agencies, perhaps, to make sure that SMEs remain as innovative as they possibly can. I'm not sure that even if we did all of these things, it's necessarily going to keep the ecosystem as vibrant as it was prior to the COVID storm, either in Ireland or in the UK. But at least this kind of big picture of encouraging collaboration and seeing collaboration for innovation as a response to the COVID storm gives us something that we know works and we know delivers high quality innovation at lower risk. So COVID has posed challenges for all of us so far, and there will be lots more to come, I suspect, over the next few months. For firms, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult to invest in risky innovation while market conditions remain difficult and they are coping with the difficulties caused by social distancing and the other restrictions which COVID-19 has brought. This theme of building collaborative innovation seems a sensible response. It allows risk sharing and cost sharing and building ecosystems which move towards a more collaborative innovation model. Seems a very sensible kind of response to the COVID storm. So we might provide better partner information so firms find it easier to make collaboration. We might provide higher grant levels for collaborative projects rather than individual firm projects. And we might focus on trying to ensure that our universities and our businesses sustain the capabilities to collaborate through the aftermath of the COVID crisis. I know government agencies in the UK and Ireland are kind of working along this theme already. And we're working very actively in my centre with Innovate UK and other UK partners to try to help them understand how the innovation world is changing and how they can respond most effectively to support innovation activity going forward. And I'm sure that kind of very positive response will be common both at regional level and national level across the UK and Ireland. I hope that's been interesting. We have a lot of challenges ahead in terms of sustaining innovation, but I think through collaboration and working together to try to solve some of these challenges, that gives us the best hope, perhaps, of sustaining innovation and competitiveness going forward. Thank you.